Welcome to our 10th annual Writers Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. I'm Dean Nelson on the journalism faculty at the university, and it's our very, very distinct pleasure to have Bill Moyers with us this evening. Bill Moyers has won more journalism awards for his commentaries and for his storytelling than most entire networks. You name the kind of award, he has won it. He has been the deputy director of the Peace Corps, a press secretary to a president, a newspaper publisher, a commentator, a journalist, overall thought provoker, especially in these last few years since his work with public television. It's a privilege, Mr. Moyers, to have you here at our symposium in your first public appearance since your retirement from television. Why don't we start with what you've been thinking about lately, and give us some thoughts and some of the things you've been just kind of rolling around with for the last few weeks.
Well, first let me express my appreciation for being here. I cannot imagine a better place to be on a Saturday night than with a bunch of Nazarenes. I grew up in Texas where there are more Baptists than people, and so it's always a pleasure to meet people of different persuasions and different faiths. I'm also here because you have such a persuasive advocate in Dean Nelson. The email he wrote me with the quote from Flannery O'Connor.
That's what did it?
That's what did it. That was hard to turn down, so that I cut short a vacation by a day in Mexico to be here, because I really wanted to respond to that invitation and to be with you this evening. Thank you for those generous remarks. That's a much better introduction than I'm used to. I gave the commencement at Dartmouth not long ago, and a young woman came up to me, had just been graduated, and said, "Mr. Moyers, you've been in both government and journalism. That makes everything you say doubly hard to believe." Doing my work in public before the camera, and I'm saying some things now they can edit out later because I know how the system works. Television makes us intimate strangers. You think you know the person you see. And I'm accustomed to someone coming up to me literally and saying, "I know you. Who are you?" And we're always saying in this business, you don't need an introduction, but that's not true. And I will tell you 3 things that happened to me one day in the same day. It was several years ago, and I had been doing a summer series at CBS News with my old friend, the late Charles Kuralt. I'm sure many of you remember Charles Kuralt, one of the great reporters. And I had also succeeded Eric Sevareid as the senior news analyst on the CBS Evening News. Eric Sevareid had been one of Edward R. Murrah's boys, one of the great reporters of all time, and he retired and I succeeded him. Summer came, August, and as happened every summer, I went home to see my parents in East Texas. And I left CBS News at 524 West 57th Street, put my bag in the trunk of the cab. My bag had the black and blue logo, the CBS logo on it, but it didn't have my name. So when we got to LaGuardia Airport, the porter reached in to pull out the bag, and he looked at it, looked up at me, looked at it, looked up at me. He said, "Aren't you on a soap opera?" I started to say, yes, the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, but I didn't. I didn't think my old friend Dan Rather would appreciate it. I went on, checked in, was reading the New York Times, and a senior citizen, a lady, her white hair came up over the logo of the Times. I pulled it down. I was looking right in her eyes, just as I'm looking at you, and she said, "Do you know who you are?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And she said, "I don't either." Took the plane to Shreveport, Louisiana, which is the airport nearest my home in East Texas. I was waiting for that same bag. So help me, this is true. I was waiting for that same bag, and another lady came up to me. She said, oh my goodness, oh, I just love your work, Mr. Kuralt." She said, "But you look different in person than you look on television." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, on television I'm fatter and balder." And she said, "That's all right, we love you both ways." And the moral of that story is not only that television makes us intimate strangers, but that so much for notoriety, right? So much for notoriety. You know, we journalists are licensed to explain things we don't understand. And since I don't understand a lot, I spent over 35 wonderful years trying to catch up. I've often said that we journalists are beachcombers on the shores of other people's knowledge and experience. We're not original. We live off the ideas and the experiences, the events in the lives of other people. So television journalism has been for me a continuing course in adult education, my own. And I've been fortunate through television to share what I have learned, to have a classroom that includes millions of people that I've been able to share with. You can tell a lot about the producer of a television broadcast if you think he or she looks out and sees a country of consumers or a country of citizens. If a producer looks out and sees a country of consumers, he or she has something to sell them. And that changes the relationship between the audience and the producer. But if you look out and see a country of citizens, you want to share things with them. You have nothing to sell them. You simply want to share with them what you see and what you learn. And that's been the core of my journalism. It explains the extraordinary range of subjects at which I've known nothing, about which I had to learn a lot in order to share them with you. From poetry to the hymn Amazing Grace, one of my favorite documentaries, to a series on the wisdom of faith, to the series with Joseph Campbell and the power of myth, to a documentary called Trade Secrets about the chemical industry's efforts to keep from its workers and its consumers the toxic qualities of its products. From a series called Close to Home, Addiction and Recovery, a series that my wife and I did. She's my wife, the president of our company, my co-executive editor on everything we do. Our 30-year-old son crashed, himself a promising journalist, crashed on cocaine addiction. Took him 10 years to come through it. He did. We did a series called Close to Home because addiction had come close to home. We did a series, the last big series we did before my recent weekly broadcast was called Becoming American, the Chinese Experience in America. Believe it or not, PBS had done the story of the Jews in America, the story of the Africans in America, the story of the Irish in America, the story of the Italians in America, but never the story of the Chinese. I knew nothing about that history. It took us 4 years to do it. I learned so much about this country. We did a series on the Hudson River, my favorite river in the country, the America's first river it was called. We've done everything that you can think about as a journalist because I believe that's our mandate, to explain things we don't understand. This is the foreword to the book Moyers on America. We journalists ride on the sand and speak into the wind. And usually by the morning after there isn't a trace of what we wrote or said. The internet has speeded up both the dissemination and the disappearance of the noise we add to the day's chatter. Millions may invite us into their living rooms, may nod in agreement or rage at our impudence, may clip our columns and stuff them in a drawer or spin them forward to distant parties via the internet. But the moment comes when, like ice, we melt into the milieu. We're lucky if someday a grandchild or graduate student is curious about what we once said or wrote. Because we're at the mercy of events we don't control, the work of journalists is as eclectic as it is transient. The world arrives at a dizzying pace. One never knows what the morning will bring or even the next hour, and we're never sure where the trail will end. We focus on the moving dot, this moving dot or that one, but we rarely pause to connect them. Reviewing these pages, I realize how much I've been guided, perhaps even without being aware of it, by the desire to try to connect some of the dots between past and present, cause and effect, us and them, you and me. Gilbert McAllister may have been responsible for this. Dr. Mack taught the introductory anthropology course at the University of Texas. I remember to this day his opening lecture when he recounted the years he had spent among the Apaches as a young graduate student. They had taught him the meaning of reciprocity. In the Apache tongue, he said, the word for grandfather is the same as the word for grandson. Generations are linked to one another in an embrace of mutual obligation. With that, he was off expounding on his conviction that through the ages, human beings have advanced more through collaboration than competition. For all the chest thumping about rugged individuals and self-made men, an ethic of cooperation inspired the social compromise that we in our best moments wove into a common enterprise. My father, drawing on his own experience, understood this. In his later years, he often reminisced about his days as a boy growing up on the Red River between Oklahoma and Texas. He was 14 when his own father died during the flu epidemic in 1918. Neighbors washed my grandfather's body. Neighbors dug his grave, and neighbors laid him in the earth. Through the years, my father was one of several men in the church who took turns sitting beside the corpse of a departed friend or fellow congregant. He often drew the midnight shift and would go directly from his vigil to his job. Shortly before his own death, as we sat talking on the front porch, I asked him, "Why did you sit up all night when you had to drive your truck all the next day?" Without hesitation, he said, "Because it was the thing we did." The thing we did. At commencement exercises, I wonder if a stranger from one generation can say much that is helpful to members of a generation who are poised on a different doorstep of time. They listen, however, when I put a loaf of bread on the lectern and tell them it represents one of the most important lessons I have ever learned as a journalist. Bread is the great reinforcer of the reality principle that life is a social, not a solitary endeavor. We depend for our bread on a host of others, most of them strangers, from the farmer to the baker to the delivery man to the shopkeeper. The Lord's Prayer, so familiar and urgent to my parents during the Great Depression, invokes the first person plural, not the first person singular. Give us this day our daily bread. Social cooperation provided the resilient environment in which American enterprise flourished. Sure, the record is stained by cruelty, racism, and violence. Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, Americans dispossessed the Indians and nurtured slavery in the cradle of liberty. Those settlers who poured into my section of Texas could be a violent lot. The natives they encountered became the loathsome red man, and 1 in 4 farmers who arrived without slaves wound up owning other human beings as chattel. The social contract extended only so far. Nonetheless, over time, in the making of America, individual initiative succeeded only when it led to a strong system of mutual support, and we learned to move beyond the laissez-faire philosophy of live and let live to an active commitment of live and help live. Civilization, as we are constantly informed by the news of the day, is not a natural act. It is rather a veneer of civility stretched across primal human appetites. Like democracy, civilization has to be willed and practiced. Otherwise, society is a war of all against all, powered by individual cunning in the pursuit of wealth and power. Look around, if you would, to see what I mean. The web of cooperation is under siege, and in these pages I try to identify the most worrisome of the indicators, economic and political elites who have created islands of gilded affluence surrounded by moats of inequality wider than any since 1929. A reactionary coalition has determined to dismantle the social safety net by bankrupting the federal treasury. I believe this unraveling of the social fabric through the growing corruption of politics by money and ideology threatens the very soul of our democracy. That's from the preface. Now, let me turn to something of a different nature. I love poetry. I have done 4, maybe 5 series about poets and poems in my long career. And I brought out 2 books about poetry. One, Moyers, called The Language of Life, and the other is Fooling with Words. I just want to read you a passage of this. This will help you understand me and why I'm a journalist, perhaps more than anything else. For most people, poetry is a solitary affair, like meditation or prayer. Edward Hirsch, in his fine new book on how to read a poem, describes poetry as a passionately private communication from a soul to another soul. And the best time for reading as the middle of the night. That's when I do mine. Robert Frost urged readers to settle down like a revolving door and make ourselves at home among the poems. I do this myself at odd times, both night and day, randomly picking up one of the poetry books scattered around the house and allowing its poems to address me as they will, like letters from old friends. The seductions and demands of modern life, however, compete for the quiet time needed for poems, and occasionally it is reported that poetry's reading constituency is eroding. I don't believe it. Poetry is not only a private act between consenting poet and reader, it is a public act as well. I've seen poems work their magic on thousands of people at once. We film at several poetry festivals. We'll film for 4 or 5 days and then edit those down into a series for PBS. The effect can be physical, like the breathless arousal that attended religious revivals in my native South. The effect can be sensual. Stanley Kunitz writes, "Every new poem is like finding a new bride. Words are so erotic, they never tire of their coupling." The effect can be intellectual, quietly opening the mind to a new way of seeing, as Mary Oliver's White Owl becomes a Buddha with wings. And it can be spiritual, a moment of transcendence, like the mystery of communion in a congregation of believers. I do not understand the power of poetry to transfigure, but I remember the first time I experienced it. We'd been studying composition in high school English, plowing through such necessary but rocky furrows as infinitives, genitives, and gerunds. The days were creaking by like turns of the torturer's rack. Then one morning, Mrs. Hughes announced that we were changing course. We were going to study poetry. That is, she would read poems to us and we would listen without commentary from her or questions from us. Inez Hughes could dissect a poem at 10 paces with her eyes closed, but she insisted that poetry requires attention before it welcomes analysis. So she read, standing with her shoulders high and her book straight and holding the Oxford Book of English Verse as far from her body as her arms would extend, she read. For the entire hour she read, until the bell rang and the spell was broken. She had a sonorous southern voice, as versatile as a pipe organ, which rose half an octave as she read. Between her native drawl and an exactness of diction acquired in elocution courses back east, her sentences could flow like a languid stream or break crisp and distinct like twigs snapping underfoot. She liked Blake, piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he, laughing, said to me, "Pipe a song about a lamb." So I piped with merry cheer, "Piper, pipe that song again." So I piped, he wept to hear. She agreed with Wordsworth. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, little we see in nature that is ours. And she was haunted by Thomas Gray. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. She often read Gray's elegy, and as she did, the poem took hold of me. Perhaps it was the rhythmic cadence, the boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, or the romantic imagery, full many a flower is born to blush unseen, or the stark reality, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. Most certainly, my teacher's voice had as much of an imprint on me as the poet's verse. Several years later, during my first visit to England, I heard her voice in my head the moment I spied the gravestones in the churchyard that Gray had immortalized. Reaching the vista that seemed so unchanged from the poem's evocation of it, I shivered slightly. I felt as if I had been there before and was even now experiencing the setting and the emotion as Gray experienced them 2 centuries earlier. Only 22 at the time, I felt sadness at the transience of my own life and gratitude for the timelessness of all life. Thomas Gray may have felt nothing of the sort, of course. It may just have been the voice in my head. But such is poetry's power, that the emotions awakened then are as real to me now. Finally,
So good. This is so good.
finally, is it okay?
It's great. It's more than okay.
My wife and I live and work 1 mile from Ground Zero, the World Trade Centers. We were at home dressing that morning, and she heard the news and came in to say the plane has hit the World Trade Center. I said, oh, some pilot must have gone berserk. We got in the cab to go to the office, and we heard that the second plane had hit, and we turned to each other and said, this is ominous. Turned out that the public television station in New York where we were, our tower, our antenna was above the World Trade Center, and we lost the antenna, of course, and we lost our chief engineer who was on duty that morning. We got to work, and PBS called me. We'd lost our power for 3 or 4 hours, and we went to an alternative generator out in New Jersey, and we were back on the air in 3 or 4 hours, feeding programming to PBS, KPBS here, and all stations around the country. The next day, PBS called me and asked me to go on the air that night with a half-hour show, just interviewing anybody I want to, just to try to make sense of this. So I went on the air, and I had my pastor, the Reverend James Forbes, the minister of the historic Riverside Baptist Church. I had a Columbia professor who'd written a great book about how Americans have lost their sense of evil. I had playwrights and dancers. I just had anybody I could think of to come on and talk. And we stayed on there for 4 weeks, just talking to people. A year later, on my show Now, I did this little essay. My colleague was in the subway below the World Trade Center when the first plane hit at 8:46 on September 11th, a year ago. Walking up the stairs to the street just as the second plane hit, she heard the boom, glanced toward the flaming towers, saw falling bodies, and shuddered. A wave of heat descended on her, and she ran, reaching safety before the buildings came down. For 2 months, she sat at the window of her apartment, paralyzed by fear. The sound of a plane would take her back to that morning as if she had witnessed the beginning of the world coming to an end. A year later, she still has nightmares, still sees in the poet's prophetic metaphor the great dark birds of history that plunged into our lives. All of us now live at Ground Zero. Sitting at our window, we wonder what's next. We walk looking over our shoulder apprehensively. This is what terrorists want, of course. They aim to pillage our peace of mind, deprive us of trust and confidence, possess our psyche, and keep us from ever again believing in a safe, decent, or just world, and from working to bring it about. This is their real target: to turn each and every imagination into a personal Afghanistan, a private hell, where they can rule by fear as the Taliban did. They win if only we let them, only if we become like them, vengeful, imperious, intolerant, paranoid, invoking a God of wrath. Having lost faith in themselves, zealots have nothing left but a holy cause. They win if we become holy warriors too, If in trying to save democracy we destroy it, if we strike first, murdering innocent people as they did, if we show contempt for how others see us, exploit patriotism to increase privilege, confuse power with the law and secrecy with security, and if we permit our leaders to use our fear of terrorism to make us afraid of the truth. What then can I say to my colleague, to myself, to all of us survivors tempted to sit there in the chair by the window? Just this. We're vulnerable not only to the fear of them, but to our own shaken faith in ourselves. I keep reminding myself to remember not only the terror, but the beauty revealed that day, when through the smoke and fire we glimpsed the heroism, compassion, and sacrifice of ordinary people who did the best of things in the worst of times. I keep telling myself that this beauty in us is real. It makes democracy possible, and no terrorist can take it from us. Remembering this 1 year later, we can praise the mutilated world and get on with our work. Democracy is our work, and there's much to do if we're to keep it. All right. Finally, the paperback edition of the book will come out in June, and it has 4 new essays in it. I'm just trying to finish in these next 48 hours this one. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it, because but I'll just give you a sense of where it's coming. It fits so well with what Jim Wallace was saying when he was here. How many of you heard Jim Wallace this week? We arrived early at New York's Riverside Church one recent morning for a memorial service in tribute to an old friend. In the quietness of the hour, I picked up a Bible from the pew and opened it randomly to the Gospel of Matthew, where the story of Jesus of Nazareth unfolds chapter by chapter. The birth at Bethlehem, the baptism in the River Jordan, the temptation in the wilderness, the Sermon on the Mount, the healing of the sick, the feeding of the hungry, the parables, the calling of the disciples, the journey to Jerusalem, and always embedded like pearls throughout the story, the teachings of compassion, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also, and whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. If you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Judge not, lest you be judged. In these pages, we're in the presence of one who clearly understands the power of love, mercy, and kindness, the gentle Jesus so familiar in art, song, and Sunday school. But then the tale suddenly shifts. Jesus' demeanor changes. The tone and temper of the narrative shift, and the Prince of Peace becomes a disturber of the peace. Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." No cheek turned there, no second mile traveled. On the contrary, Jesus grows angry. He passes judgment, and he takes action. I closed the Bible and sat quietly, turning the text over and again in my head, absorbing the image of Jesus striding through the holy precincts, excoriating strangers, upsetting their transactions, scattering their money across the floor, bouncing them forcefully from the temple. Indignant at a profane violation of the sacred, Jesus threw the rascals out. Anyone who happened down the aisle at that moment would have found me smiling. It was good to be reminded that there's a place for anger in the world. Good to remember that there are some things worth getting mad about. Here's one. Under a headline stretching 6 columns across the page, the New York Times reported on March 10th that tuition in the city's elite private schools, kindergarten as well as high school, would hit $26,000 for the coming year. On the same page, under a 2-column headline, the Times reported on a school in nearby Mount Vernon, just across the city line from the Bronx, with a student body that is 97% black. It is the poorest school in town. 9 out of 10 children qualify for free lunches. 1 out of 10 lives in a homeless shelter. During Black History Month this past February, a 6th grader who wanted to write a report on Langston Hughes could find not a single book about Hughes in the library, nothing about the man or his poems. There's only 1 book in the library on Frederick Douglass, none on Rosa Parks, Josephine Baker, Leontyne Price, or other pathbreakers like them in the modern era. Except for a few Newbery Award books bought by the librarian with her own money, an old story, the books are largely from the 1950s and 60s when all the children were white. A child's primer on work begins with a youngster learning how to be a telegraph delivery boy. All the jobs described in the book, the dry cleaner, the delivery man, the cleaning lady, are white. There's a 1967 book about telephones with the instruction, quote, when you phone, you usually dial the number, but on some new phones, you can push buttons. The newest encyclopedia dates from 1991. With 2 volumes, B and R missing. There is no card catalog in the library, no index cards or computer. Something to get mad about. Here's something else. Caroline Payne's face and gums are distorted because her Medicaid-financed dentures don't fit. Her appearance has caused her to be continuously turned down for jobs. Carolyn Payne is one of the people in David Shipler's new book, The Working Poor, Invisible in America. She was born poor, although she once owned her own home and earned a 2-year college degree. Carolyn Payne has bounced from one poverty-wage job to another all of her life, equipped with the will to move up, but lacking the resources to deal with such unexpected and overlapping problems as a mentally handicapped daughter, a broken marriage, a sudden layoff that forced her to sell her few assets, pull up her roots, and move on. In the house of the poor, Shipler writes, the walls are thin and fragile, and troubles seep into one another. Something else. A few months ago, the House of Representatives, now a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate, political, and religious right, approved new tax credits for children. Not for poor children, mind you, but for families earning as much as $310,000 a year. Families that already enjoy significant benefits from earlier tax cuts. The editorial page of the Washington Post called this bad social policy, bad tax policy, and bad fiscal policy. You'd think they'd be embarrassed, said the Post, but they're not. Nothing seems to embarrass the political class in Washington today. Not the fact that more children are growing up in poverty in America than in any other industrial nation. Not the fact that millions of workers are actually making less money today in real dollars than they did 20 years ago. Not the fact that working people are putting in longer and longer hours and still falling behind. Not the fact that while we have the most advanced medical care in the world, nearly 44 million Americans, 8 out of 10 of them working families, are uninsured and cannot get the basic care they need. Astonishing as it seems, official Washington appears in no way embarrassed by the fact that the gap between rich and poor in America is greater than it's been in 50 years, the worst inequality among all Western nations. You can't even get them to acknowledge that we're experiencing a shift in poverty. For years we were told that those people down there at the bottom were single, jobless mothers. For years, they were told they would move up the economic ladder if they would only go to school, work hard, and get married. But now poverty is showing up where we didn't expect it, among families that include 2 parents, a worker, and a head of the household with more than a high school education. These are the newly poor whom our political elites expect to climb out of poverty on a downward moving escalator. Then I go on in the rest of this essay to lay the basis. I don't go to Marx, I go to The Economist, which is the pro-business newspaper published in London, the best friend capitalism has. And on the Sunday before George W. Bush's inauguration, they ran a big special study on how upward mobility in America has come to a screeching halt. And that there are not going to be the Bill Moyerses of the future who come out of parents whose father never made more than $100 a year and went to a free public school, driving a $450 car down a free public highway, stopping to rest in free public parks, and taking his books out of a free public library. I mean, upward mobility in this country, says The Economist. I'm not making this up, says The Economist, and others, has come to a screeching halt in this country. And when you take that out of the middle, when you start shrinking the middle class of a vast nation like this, you're headed for serious trouble and the loss of the American dream. That's what the rest of the essay will say. But then I've got to write that this week, but then I've already written the opening and the conclusion. Here's the conclusion. I've been back to Riverside Church from time to time since that memorial service and the random encounter with Matthew's Gospel. I've sat in that same pew and reflected on how in the past generation, as the number of poor increased, wages fell, health and housing costs exploded, and wealth and media became more and more concentrated, prophetic religion lost its voice. The religious right drowned out everyone else, and they hijacked Jesus. The very Jesus who stood in his hometown and proclaimed, "The Lord has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor." The very Jesus who told 5,000 hungry people, not just the people in the box seats, would be fed. The very Jesus who challenged the religious orthodoxy of his day by feeding the hungry on the Sabbath, who offered kindness to the prostitute and hospitality to the outcast, who said the kingdom of heaven belongs to little children, who raised the status of women and treated even the hated tax collector like a citizen of the kingdom. The indignant Jesus, who drove the money changers from the temple, has been hijacked and turned from a friend of the dispossessed into a guardian of privilege, a militarist, hedonist, and lobbyist, sent prowling the halls of Congress in Gucci's, seeking tax breaks and loopholes for the powerful, costly new weapon systems, and punitive public policies for people without political power. Yet it was this very Jesus, the Jesus aroused to indignation by the profaning of the sacred, who inspired a Methodist ship caulker named Edward Rogers to crusade across New England for an 8-hour workday, called Francis Williams to rise up against the sweatshop, sent Dorothy Day to march alongside auto workers in Michigan, brewery workers in New York, and marble cutters in Vermont, roused E.B. McKinney and Owen Whitfield to stand against a Mississippi oligarchy that held sharecroppers in servitude, summoned a young priest named John Ryan 10 years before the New Deal to champion child labor laws, unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, and decent housing for the poor, and summoned Martin Luther King to Memphis to march with sanitation workers in their struggle for a living wage. This struggle for a just world goes on. It is not a partisan affair. No matter if you're liberal or conservative, God is neither. No matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, God is neither. To see whose side God is on, just go to the Bible. It is the widow and the orphan, the stranger and the poor who are blessed in the eyes of God. It is kindness and mercy that prove the power of faith, and justice that measures the worth of the state. Kings are held accountable for how the poor fare under their reign. Prophets speak to the gap between the rich and the poor as a reason for God's judgment. Poverty and justice are religious issues, and Jesus moves among the disinherited. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me. This is the Jesus who challenges the complacency of both political parties. If he found himself among Republicans today, I think he would shame them. If he appeared among Democrats, I think he would shake them up. He drove the money changers from the temple of Jerusalem. We must drive them from the temples of democracy. So, there you go. Sorry. Thank you.
You have, for years, just been one of the culture's great storytellers. And it seems to me that you have studied storytelling with all of the people you have interviewed and talked to, and you've talked to some of the great storytellers yourself. And I'm just wondering, and I suspect you've thought about this, why are stories so important to civilization?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. No, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. If you come from our tradition, you know that when God wanted to speak to human beings, the message was contained in the form of a human being who told stories, parables. So there is something essential to the nature of communication that requires stories to organize abstract ideas or distant experiences and put them in a shape that resonate with us because we all live a story. We all are a story. Nothing fascinates me more than the making of a human life. And I'll sit by a stranger and start saying, where are you coming from? And where did you come from? Who were your parents? And pretty soon I've begun to get the bare outlines of a fascinating story. There are 500, 400 interesting stories in this room tonight. And so stories give us a way of wrapping our attention around what would otherwise be an abstraction or a distant body of knowledge that we could not from our own experience connect with. So stories take the experiences of other people and put them in a form that make us say, oh, I understand that because I know I'm a story too, or I'm about a story. In the South, you know, where I grew up, when literacy was not very high, people told stories in order to describe experiences. I to this day, I hear Mrs. Platt across the back fence from our little house in Marshall, Texas, talking to her daughter, Marie Davis, telling her a story. I remember the Mangums sitting on the porch across East Austin Street in the evening, in the twilight, Mr. Mangum smoking away, and they were talking about their ancestors. And across on the right side of our little house, we all lived so close together, you could just hear everybody's conversation. The Burbages sat outside. She was a hairdresser, and he lived off of her take. And they sat in their canvas, green and white canvas captain's chairs out there at the end of the day telling stories. I lie in bed at night and listen to people coming back from the theater, from the Paramount and Lynn theaters at night, 9 o'clock, 9:30. My bed was very close to the sidewalk. I could hear them describing the story they had just been to the movies to see. Stories are essential communication. They are the way we understand each other, the world, and ideas. And our best presidents have been storytellers. Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan was a great storyteller. And we just need to get our information in receptacles that we can swallow, and those receptacles are stories about human experience. So I think that the movies have also helped. Of course, great novels did too, but I think movies have become the novels of our day. I love a good movie because of the way they organize the story. I don't call myself a writer because I work in television, and there we are married to the picture. You cannot tell an audience, see Mary run. The audience is seeing Mary run. You've got to find the haiku, the poetic line that doesn't step on the picture's foot. I often describe writing for television as writing between the lines, and in order to waltz with the image. So you know, when you see a couple waltzing, you see a good story. You're hearing in your mind a good story. Stories are just the essential form that we human beings have developed to understand our experience or to make sense of our universe. That's why Joseph Campbell, that series with him I did, was so successful. He was a great storyteller. I don't think he was he had the extraordinary IQ, but he had studied all the stories of the world. He was our best synthesizer and interpreter of the world's great literature, and he could tell a story that would enable you to say, oh, I see that. I didn't understand what might have been a platitude or what might have been a philosophy or what might have been a bromide, but when he put it in the form of a story, we got it. So the answer to your question, I think, Dean, is that stories enable us to get it, and I think that's why we rely on them.
Now, you've also, let me change directions here, you've also been critical, you were even tonight, about a kind of journalism, for instance, that treats people as consumers instead of citizens.
I'm hoping that the internet allows individual storytellers to emerge in ways that they are now closed out from the big monolithic media companies. One of the greatest dangers in America today is that increasingly fewer and fewer mega media companies own most of the outlets that provide what you read, see, and hear. And as these big companies have taken over the outlets of journalism, their commitment is to the bottom line. And you can, in a society, make a lot more money entertaining people than informing them, and you can make more money informing them about basic things like the weather, crime, violence, and related themes than you can about telling them the complicated stories they need to know about the truth behind the news. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as these big companies have taken over radio, television, cable, they have pushed journalism down to the lowest form, to the lowest rung on the ladder of hierarchies in their company. You can't tell me Michael Eisner cares that much about the evening news at ABC News back in New York when he can make so much more money with his movies. He thinks a lot more about the movies than he does about the journalism. So also you have these big media companies that want favors from a deregulating government. They want the power to consolidate even more. They want the power to grow even larger. And so they've got interest in Washington that journalism can disturb. Michael Eisner, when he took over ABC, when Disney bought ABC, Michael Eisner said he didn't want ABC News covering Disney's affairs. Why? Well, it's a business, and it does things that it doesn't want known. I've always thought that news is what people want to keep hidden. Everything else is publicity.
As I look at kind of your career arc, you started in journalism, you went with the Peace Corps, you went into seminary, got training in the ministry, worked for President Johnson, back into journalism. Was there anything in common throughout that, or did it all just seem to be like all over the place?
It has been all over the place. I've been very fortunate to keep reinventing myself, and I keep telling young people today, you're going to have to reinvent yourself quite often. Over the course of your life, you're going to live a lot longer than I did, and you're going to have you're going to lose these jobs and lose and get other jobs. You're going to have to keep reinventing yourself. But yes, I think that in everything I did, that I kept coming back essentially to what these English teachers in high school and college talked about, which is that you're here to signify, you're here to learn. You're curious. I mean, a journalist is nothing but a lifelong student, as I said in the opening of this, and so it's the passion to know what I don't know, whether it was in journalism or in seminary or in government or in politics or in the newspaper business or in broadcasting. It was just a passion to know. I remember I was a very good test taker. I loved tests because you got to study for that test, take it, and then forget everything you'd learned. And that's a lot like a journalist. You know, we do this story or this special or that series, and then we forget it. But I think what joins all of those endeavors in which I have participated is a deep passion for knowing. I'll read you just a little bit of the first essay in the book. On my 16th On my 16th birthday in 1950, I went to work for the daily newspaper in the small East Texas town where I grew up. It was a good place to be a cub reporter, small enough to navigate but big enough to keep me busy and learning something every day. I soon had a stroke of luck. Some of the old-timers were on vacation or out sick, and I got assigned to cover what came to be known as the Housewives' Rebellion. 15 women in my hometown decided not to pay the Social Security withholding tax for their domestic workers. They argued that Social Security was unconstitutional, that imposing it was taxation without representation, and that, here's my favorite part, requiring us to collect the tax is no different from requiring us to collect the garbage. They hired themselves a lawyer, none other than Martin Dias Jr., the former congressman best known or worst known for his work as head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities in the 1930s and 40s. He was no more effective at defending rebellious women than he had been protecting against communist subversives. And eventually the housewives wound up holding their noses and paying the tax. The stories I wrote for my local paper were picked up on the Associated Press wire. One day, the managing editor called me over and pointed to the AP ticker beside his desk. Moving across the wire was a notice citing one Bill Moyers and the paper for the reporting we had done on the rebellion. That hooked me. And in one way or another, after a detour, this is the answer to your question, that hooked me. And in one way or another, after a detour through seminary and then into politics and government for a spell, I've been covering the class war ever since. Those women in Marshall, Texas were its advance guard. Not bad people. They were regulars at church. Their children were my friends. Many of them were active in community affairs, and their husbands were pillars of the business and professional class. They were respectable and upstanding citizens all. So it took me a while to figure out what had brought on that spasm of reactionary rebellion. It came to me one day, much later. They simply couldn't see beyond their own prerogatives. Fiercely loyal to their families, to their clubs, charities, and congregations, fiercely loyal, in other words, to their own kind, they narrowly defined membership in democracy to include only people like them. The women who washed and ironed their laundry, wiped their children's bottoms, made their husbands' beds, and cooked their families' meals. These women, too, would grow old and frail, sick and decrepit, lose their husbands and face the ravages of time alone with nothing to show from their years of labor but the creases in their brow and the knots on their knuckles. In one way or another, this is the oldest story in America. The struggle to determine whether we, the people, is a spiritual idea embedded in a political reality, one nation, indivisible, or merely a charade masquerading as piety and manipulated by the powerful and privileged to sustain their own way of life at the expense of others. I should make it clear that I don't harbor any idealized notion of politics and democracy. After all, I worked for Lyndon Johnson. Nor do I romanticize the people. You should read my mail or listen to the vitriol virtually spat at my answering machine, and then I say, I understand what the politician meant who told me once of the Texas House of Representatives, if you think these guys are bad, you should see their constituents. But there is nothing idealized or romantic about the difference between a society whose arrangements roughly serve all its citizens and one whose institutions have been converted into a stupendous fraud. That difference can be the difference between democracy and oligarchy. And the answer to your question, I think, is that whether I was in journalism or whether I was at seminary studying under a great ethicist named Thomas Maston at Southwestern Theological Seminary, or in government organizing the Peace Corps with Sergeant Shriver, or at the White House, first my job before I was press secretary I was President Johnson's policy person. I supervised the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, 66, the War on Poverty, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, or whether I was publishing a newspaper that won not because of me, but because of the reporters, 2 Pulitzer Prizes for investigative reporting, or my 33 years in public broadcasting, this sense of what is it that makes a society? What is it that makes a just society? What is it that makes so many disparate people from different parts of the world into Americans and enables this vast nation to work without turning again as it did in the Civil War? Remember, I'm a Southerner. I grew up in a part of the country that denied the truth of slavery for 300 years, and then it took a bitter civil war to resolve slavery, and then it took another 100 years before we actually achieved what the victory at Appomattox was meant to make possible. I served in the Johnson White House when we went to war in Vietnam, and we drew the wagons around us and began not to want to listen to voices other than the official view of reality. So I know what it means to deny the truth. I know what it means to lie to yourself. I know what it means to live a lie, as Southerners lived a lie for 300 years, and as we lived a lie for a couple of years in the Johnson administration when we kept telling ourselves we were winning out there. So from the beginning to now, I think what really drives me is this wanting America to succeed, and knowing that we're never going to succeed unless we honor the dissenters, unless we honor the journalists, unless we honor those who, in effect, get up on the deck of the ship, grab the captain by the elbow and say, that's an iceberg out there. This self-correcting faculty in democracy is what saves us from ourselves. And in order to know what it takes to change course, we have to seek the truth. When I graduated from the University of Texas, I looked up at that great tower on the campus there, and across the face of it are carved the words, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." I really believe that. And I think from those early days wondering about the Marshall housewives until today, worried about why a president of the United States, well-loved, well-taught, and well-churched, is so indifferent to the lived realities of other people's lives. Worried about what that means for Henry, who's 12, and Thomas, who's 10, and Nancy, who's 8, and Jassy, who's 3, and Sarah Jane, who's 1, my 5 grandchildren. Wondering if we don't get it right, they won't have the chance to do so. And I think that's what combines all of these interests.
Bill Moyers, thank you for being with us.